To get started with AWS Amplify identity pools, it is essential to understand the basics of AWS Amplify and identity pools. AWS Amplify is a development platform that helps you build, deploy, and manage scalable mobile and web applications. Identity pools, on the other hand, are stores of user identity data that provide temporary AWS credentials for access to AWS services. First, you need to set up an identity pool in the AWS Management Console or using the AWS CLI. When setting up an identity pool, you need to choose the authentication providers, such as Amazon Cognito User Pools, Facebook, or Google. You also need to configure the identity pool to use the chosen authentication providers. Once the identity pool is set up, you can integrate it with your application using the AWS Amplify SDK. The SDK provides a simple and unified API for accessing AWS services, including identity pools. You can use the SDK to authenticate users, manage user sessions, and access AWS services. One key concept to understand when working with identity pools is the difference between authenticated and unauthenticated users. Authenticated users are users who have been verified by an authentication provider, while unauthenticated users are users who have not been verified. Identity pools provide different levels of access to AWS services for authenticated and unauthenticated users. To manage access to AWS services, you need to configure the identity pool to use IAM roles. IAM roles define the permissions that are granted to users when they access AWS services. You can configure the identity pool to use different IAM roles for authenticated and unauthenticated users. Best practices for using AWS Amplify identity pools include using secure authentication providers, configuring IAM roles to grant least privilege access, and monitoring user activity. You should also use AWS CloudWatch to monitor and troubleshoot issues with your identity pool. In practical terms, using AWS Amplify identity pools can simplify the process of managing user identity and access to AWS services. For example, you can use identity pools to provide temporary access to AWS services for users who are not authenticated, or to provide access to AWS services for users who are authenticated with a specific authentication provider. In conclusion, AWS Amplify identity pools provide a powerful and flexible way to manage user identity and access to AWS services. By following best practices and understanding key concepts, you can use identity pools to simplify the process of managing user identity and access to AWS services, and build more scalable and secure applications.